Now, have you ever heard of MSI? They're actually one of the largest motherboard manufacturers out there, but they don't just make motherboards. They make laptops and desktops and all kinds of PC hardware, and it turns out that they are also one of the most secretive companies in the world. Their story is long and complicated with roots dating back to Taiwan in 1973, when the electronics industry was just starting out over there. Now, it turns out that MSI was not the first company that these guys worked with. The very first product that this company sold was actually a Quanta-branded desktop computer in 1981. In fact, they didn't even start making their own branded products until 1982. And even then, they were uncalled MSI. They were originally called MicroStar International, and their first product was actually a single-board computer called the 5100. I do want to know how many of you remember those. But basically, it was like a DIY motherboard with a CPU and memory and everything else. You would need to build your own computer except for a case power supply and peripherals. So the 5100 actually had room inside of it for a keyboard and a floppy drive and even a monochrome monitor. Yeah, it was like one of those old Macintosh trash cans, but without the mouse or the graphics. Anyways, the company saw a lot of success selling these single-board computers throughout the mid-1980s. It was an innovative way to sell PCs at a time when most people were still buying them assembled. But obviously, it did leave a lot to be desired in terms of ease of use, because you still had to hook everything up yourself and put it together. So in 1986, they launched the next generation of their single-board computer, the 530, which included built-in support for a full VGA card. So no more boring black and white text. You could finally play some colorful games if you wanted to. And this actually led to a whole new market for MSI, where they started offering pre-assembled computers based on their single-board computers. So they would take the single board, put it into a chassis with a power supply and maybe a couple of drives and sell it as an off-the-shelf system. But these systems were still referred to as single-board computers, even though they now included everything you needed to get started. In 1989, they decided to rebrand these systems as desktop PCs, and they came out with the 5. And by this point, they were actually selling quite a few different models of desktops, including some smaller form factors that they called tiny because it was 1989 and small was cool. Just ask New Coke. By the early 1990s, MSI was actually growing faster than many of their competitors because they had this unique approach to manufacturing where they vertically integrated their entire process. So instead of outsourcing things like cases and PSUs and motherboards from different companies, they brought all of those functions in-house, and this allowed them to increase quality control while reducing costs. And they had the benefit of having a really deep bench of engineers. That meant that they could design a whole system around a specific target price and then figure out what components they would need to use to hit that target. For example, in 1992, they introduced the 2486 motherboard, which featured an original design CPU cooler. This was at a time when Intel CPUs ran super hot and required big, bulky coolers that were often too large to fit inside of a typical PC case. So MSI took matters into their own hands and designed a low-profile heatsink that didn't compromise airflow. Throughout the rest of the 90s, MSI continued to innovate with new products, like the first Intel Pentium motherboard and the first 64-bit motherboard. And they also expanded their presence outside of Taiwan, opening up offices all over the world. But despite all of their success, they never actually became publicly traded until 2008, and so for decades they were one of the biggest motherboard manufacturers in the world, yet nobody knew who they were. Their products were always stamped with the OEM that they were made for. So if you bought a motherboard from Dell, it might have said MSI on it, but you would have no way of knowing that unless you looked at the fine print. As it turns out, the reason why they kept such a low profile for so long is that they wanted to focus on serving their clients rather than building up their own brand. And I guess it worked because today they are still one of the top 3 motherboard manufacturers in the world alongside Asus and Gigabyte, although in recent years it seems like Asus has pulled way ahead of everyone else. Now I can only speculate as to why MSI chose to remain anonymous for so long, but I'm guessing that it had something to do with protecting their core business. During the 1990s, the majority of their revenue came from selling motherboards and other components to big PC manufacturers. And at the time, margins in the consumer electronics industry were razor thin. So if you were trying to sell a computer that was based on an MSI motherboard, there was no way you were going to be able to add any kind of markup to it without looking like a total crook. But that's all changed with the rise of e-commerce and online retail. As it turns out, people were more than happy to buy motherboards and GPUs and other PC components directly, and they didn't care whether or not the manufacturer was known or unknown. All they cared about was price and performance. And that's why we see so many brands out there today that are completely unknown to the average person. There's Aorus and PowerColor and XFX. None of those names really mean anything to consumers, but they are household names within the industry. And it also explains why MSI has been spending so much money on marketing over the past decade, because they essentially playing catch-up. They spent decades focusing on building their business and expanding their operations, and now they spending billions trying to get people to recognize their logo. Today, MSI employs over 17,000 people worldwide and generates over $4 billion in revenue per year. They are truly a massive company, and yet they are still majority owned by their founder, Joe Chen, who owns just under 50% of the shares, and he's still involved in the day-to-day operations. He actually shows up to work every day at 6 a.m. and leaves at 6 p.m., but he doesn't spend his days crunching numbers. He prefers to walk around the factory floor and chat with employees, but he is stepping away a bit more these days. He recently donated $30 million to a university in Taipei to help fund a new engineering program. And he's also been mentoring young entrepreneurs. So maybe MSI will be less of a secret in the future. Maybe their name will be synonymous with quality and reliability, just like Dell and HP. But only time will tell. But what about you? Did you already know that MSI was a huge company? Or are you surprised to learn about their history? Let me know down in the comments. And definitely give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'll see you guys in the next one.